got interested in economics as a senior. I took for at Caltech in those days, you didn't take economics until you were a senior, and it was a 1/4 course. And so that got me interested, quite interested. I had no idea that any such field even existed at that time. So I decided, because of that interest in economics, to go back to the University of Kansas, because tuition would be much lower. I was on my own now entirely, and so the tuition was very modest at KU. So I got a master's degree in economics at KU, and that enabled me. I realized, yes, this is what I'm interested in. And so then I went on to Harvard from there for my PhD. And then my first position was at Purdue University. Well, it was the genius of Adam Smith, you see, to see that. And his metaphor of the invisible hand, precisely as he refers to this, the unintended consequences that come out, and those are consequences for the good in creating wealth, that flow from each person kind of himself doing his own thing. Okay. So, well, now think about my experiments. That's exactly what was happening in the experiments. Each person, each buyer and selling is just trying to do the best for himself. Well, together, that market, they create gains from exchange, and there's a huge amount of surplus created in those market experiments. The difference is in the experiments, because the experimenter gives the values and costs to people, we can actually measure the surplus. We can measure how much wealth it comes out of that. So the experiment, now I didn't understand all of this, you understand, Andeaux, at the time that I did these experiments, but I later came to realize that this is exactly what Adam Smith was talking about, you see. And so I came to realize that he probably would have loved experimental economics, because it was a nice way to study some of the things that some of the principles that he came up with, over 2 centuries ago. Oh, yes, I would love to go back to the period when Adam Smith lived. You see, and he was born in 1723, and he died in 1790. That was the period that he was. And David Hume, who was a philosopher, was a little older than Adam Smith. David Hume would have been about 11 years old when Adam Smith was born. And David Hume became sort of arguably one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. He certainly was the greatest English philosopher of that period. And they knew each other. They were good friends. And then there were other people that lived at that time. For example, a good friend of Adam Smith was James Hutton. Well, James Hutton was a geologist. And in fact, by studying the erosion on the cliffs around Edinburgh, he came up with this notion that the Earth was under constant change, and in terms of kind of water and wind erosion on the soils, on the cliffs of the planet and everything. Well, that became a science. And 100 years later, the early work that James Hutton did in geology created the science of the Earth. And then there was another friend of Adam Smith and James Hutton, and that was Joseph Black. And Joseph Black was what we would today call a physical chemist. Okay, he did the first experiments that proved that air must be a mixture of different gases. And the way he proved it was he burned something in the presence of air and then came up with a way of weighing the chamber after he had burnt the oxygen out of it and found that it weighed less. So in other words, the combustion had used up one of the gases, but there was still something that was very much like air, you see, left even after you took the oxygen out of it. Well, they didn't know about oxygen yet. And then later, another a man by the name of Young, I've forgotten his first name, a British scientist, was able to identify the compound in air that enables the fire to be supported. Okay, the oxygen is what it enables. You see, something to be burned, to be converted from a solid into a gas as a result of its interaction with oxygen. So the 18th century in Scotland was a pretty exciting time because you had all of these people not only in economics and sociology creating new fields, but also people in geology and in physics creating new kind of a new science, and so and of course all of them had, see, Newton would have, Isaac Newton died, let me see, in 1727, when Adam Smith was 4 years old. Well, in other words, Isaac Newton lived into the 18th century, and his work, although most of it was in the 17th century, it very much influenced everybody's thinking in the 18th century. And in a way, this is where the original kind of concept of invisible hand kind of comes from, because what accounts for the movement of the masses of planets and this sort of thing? Well, it's this invisible force of gravity, you see. So the notion that there can be forces that determine what we observed, but we can't see those forces, you see, and we can only and if we have a theory of how those forces work, we can explain observations. Okay, we can observe we can explain those observations, but it doesn't mean we have to know all about that invisible force. And in a sense, you see, what the invisible hand in Adam Smith's markets were very much like gravity in Newton's system. You see, there were forces at work there that people were not aware of that created what was observed. And I think the experiments enabled us to see kind of more clearly, model kind of what people were doing. And of course, the people in the experiments don't have to understand anything about the models in order to really perform in ways that are predictable from those models. And so it's so the invisible hand metaphor is a very good one for both, physics and other fields of science as well as social science. Well, he very much admired the American colonies because he saw them as the new nation as being much more open than the United Kingdom had been, not only in markets, but in all institutions. Also, I think the other thing is that Adam Smith wrote a far more popular and successful book when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, but very soon thereafter, leaders in the UK government, some of the leaders in the United States, like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, these guys would have been aware of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you see, and the writings. And so it was starting to influence, it very quickly influence affairs of state, because the politicians of the day were reading Adam Smith. As a result, I've been called upon, had a lot more opportunities to confer with policymakers, both private and government peoples that have reputations reputations in certain, maybe some industrial fields or scientific fields or in government. I've had a lot more opportunities, you see, to participate in conferences and programs that have been concerned with what private or public policies, how they might be changed. And that's, of course, I'm not so interested in that I want to devote all my time to it, because I'm still active in research, and also I'm still active and involved with students. I don't teach a lot of, I don't teach as much in the way of regular classes as I once did, but what I do is participate in other people's classes, come in, and I do that both not only at Chapman, but I've really participated in a lot of that at other universities, and in not only in the United States, but in Europe and the United Kingdom. And China. Earlier, I made several trips to China, both Hong Kong and the mainland. And so that you have now this alternative currency, which not only, now it's true that these currencies tend to be very volatile in prices. Bitcoin has been moving around all over the place, but that doesn't mean it can't be used for transaction purposes. What's important is if you can go from dollars into Bitcoin, and from Bitcoin into euros, and that cost of going in, of making those transactions, if it can be done fairly fast, the fact that the currency is volatile isn't a problem, you see. And if you can make the in and out trips at a fairly low cost of conversion, then you have a way of using that currency for transactions purposes, even though it doesn't look like a very good currency as a store of value because it's so volatile, you see. Also, eventually these may become less volatile. I don't know. The point is that I think it's great to have these experiments going on, and I don't know whether these currencies are going to take hold and become an important part of international trade, or whether they're going to fail. But there's no reason, I think, not to for us to have those experiments to see if they can find a niche that that people find valuable. I think there's a reasonably good chance that these cryptocurrencies, you see, will become important, and so that there will be 100 years from now, people will have private currencies that are the major means of exchange, rather than public currencies with government backing. I think that's a reasonable prospect. I think it's going to be governments are going to resist this. You see, they're not going to. Already, there are prominent economists who don't like these cryptocurrencies because they see the monetary and system of the United States as an important part of public policy and an important means by which the government can have more control over demand and supply generally in the economy, and they see that as important because they're less trustful of markets just left to their own devices. And of course, it is true that markets can get into trouble, but what people don't understand is that those are when markets are getting into trouble, it has to do with stuff that's retradable. And you see, 75% of private product can't be retraded, and that's very stable. All the instability in national economies are coming from the 25% of goods, and these are non-durable goods. You see that are retradable, and that's where instability comes, because of this disconnect you can have between the use value of something and its exchange value out there in markets, where those can get disconnected. And and I think laboratory experiments have enabled us to greatly understand to penetrate those two types of markets and enable us to see why the one set are so stable, whereas the other can be quite unstable. And now it's unclear how the cryptocurrencies fit into that. You see, I'm sure that there are some questions that no one has yet examined that might be answered in the laboratory concerning the role that cryptocurrencies might have, either in terms of stabilizing or maybe destabilizing certain kinds of markets. They had one book that one's fairly easy. I would have them read The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Here's a lot of stuff that was rediscovered without any influence from Adam Smith. And here we find that, remarkably, he had a way of modeling and thinking about that stuff. So he really deserves our careful attention. Anybody who could have done that was somehow thinking so far out of the box that even later generations weren't able to catch on to that to those thoughts and see the wisdom there, you say. So a lot of this stuff had to be kind of reinvented.